Hey everyone, this is our Sunday Bible study for November 29th, 2020. We are in the Foundations material from the Gospel Advocate, going through the material that we would normally be looking at on Sunday mornings in the adult class, just doing that by way of video now. And we are ready for Lesson 13, the last lesson for this quarter. And it is entitled Sodom and Gomorrah. It's taken from Genesis chapter 19, verses 12 through 29. The author in our little book begins by saying, describing God to the Christians in Rome. The Apostle Paul wrote, "Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell severity, but towards you goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise you also will be cut off." Romans 11:22. The author of Hebrews echoed that idea when he said it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, Hebrews 10:31. Although God is loving and merciful, he is also righteous and just. He rewards the faithful, he punishes the wicked. The book of Genesis depicts God's willingness to protect his followers and punish the rebellious in two very memorable events. The first time this happens is when the earth is destroyed by a global flood in Genesis chapter 6 through 8. The flood occurred because God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Chapter 6 and verse 5. Consequently, God said, "I will destroy man who I have created from the face of the earth," in verse 7. Noah and his family were the only individuals who did not perish. God extended his goodness to Noah and his family, but was severe toward all others. Genesis also reports God's willingness to both protect his followers and punish the wicked by recounting his destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This took place because the sin of the inhabitants of those cities was very grave. Nevertheless, God did not destroy everyone in Sodom. Before the destruction occurred, Abraham asked the Lord, "Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked?" in chapter 18 and verse 23. Abraham's going to plead from Sodom. He then asks in verse 25, "And shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" No doubt Abraham had his nephew Lot in mind as he asked these questions. God even agreed to spare the city if 10 righteous individuals could be found. Verse 32. You may recall in chapter 18, towards the latter half, there's this back and forth between God and Abraham. God says, would you not destroy the city if there were 50 righteous found in it? God said, "I wouldn't destroy it for 50. And Abraham says, "Well, what about 45? And they continue to go down till eventually it gets to 10. And God agrees that he would not destroy the city even if 10 righteous could be found within it. Sadly, 10 could not be found. Only Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters left before the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah. As we study our lesson text, Genesis 19, 12 through 29, we will be reminded of the urgency of obedience to God. God was willing to save Lot and his family from the destruction he intended to bring on Sodom and Gomorrah, but they had to comply with his terms. They had to leave the city in a timely manner, and they had to do exactly as they were told. Obedience resulted in deliverance. Disobedience resulted in death. When the Apostle Peter recounted this event in the New Testament, he described how God turned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. He then concluded that the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. God extends grace to all and is merciful to those who yield to him, but he will not tolerate sinful rebellion forever. A lesson that we would do well, the author says, to remember. So we dive into this chapter, and before we get to verse 12, I want us to begin with verses 1 through 11. Which kind of lay the backdrop and gives us some additional information on why God chose to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. In verse 1, now the angels came to Sodom in the evening. These were the The two angels, two of them who had, you remember Abraham had three visitors in chapter 18. One of them is described as the Lord, using that covenant name Yahweh. And then there were two others that were with him, and we learn now these two were angels. And so now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed his face toward the ground. And he said, "Here now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night. Wash your feet, that you may rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, but we will spend the night in the open square." But he insisted strongly. So they turned into him and entered his house. Then he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to them, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out that we may know them." The New King James adds the word carnally, and they add that for clarification. It's not in the original text. I only bring that up because it's important to note that the Bible just says there that they may know them. But I think the New King James, they didn't do it wrong here, because as we're going to see in verse 6 and following, that's obviously what the purpose of this visit by this mob was. And we see that beginning in verse 6. So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, "Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly." Now, if they were just wanting to get to know them, ask them some questions, see where they're from, have a conversation, there's nothing wicked about that. So why would Lot say, "Do not do so wickedly"? Well, because that wasn't the purpose of their visit. They wanted to get to know them, as the New King James says, carnally. Verse 8, "See now I have 2 daughters, who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, that you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof." Now, what Lot does here is not right, but it also further cements the purpose of this mob's visit. Lot says, "I've got 2 daughters. I'll bring them out to you. You can do with them as you will." Once again, Lot's not right in this. And God's not going to allow that to take place, as we see beginning in verse 9. We're reading all this, and I'm bringing all this up because there is a push to say that Sodom was not destroyed, partially at least, because of homosexuality. I have no doubt that there were other sins in Sodom, other things that led to their destruction as well. But to try to say that this is not one of the reasons is ignoring the text of the Bible. Why is it that this is the one example that is brought up? The push to remove that is one of the reasons, of course, is a push to normalize and say that homosexuality is not wrong. Friends, when we do that, we ignore the text. I don't know how you read these few verses and not get that that's part of the reason for their destruction. What many will say was that their sin was not being hospitable. That's not what's being discussed here in these few verses. It's very obvious if you read it with an open mind what the reasoning here, what the sin is. Verse 9, "And they, the angels, said, 'Stand back.' Then they said, 'This one who came in to stay here and keeps acting as a judge, now we will deal worse with them.'" They were telling Lot there to stand back. "We will deal worse with you than with them." So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. But the men, speaking of the angels, reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great. So they became weary trying to find the door. The little book says that Lot chose to locate in the plain of Jordan, where he and Abraham parted company. At this time, his decision seemed prudent, for he sought adequate land to sustain his growing flocks and herds. What he failed to consider, however, is that by choosing the plain of Jordan and eventually settling in Sodom, he left Canaan, the promised land. Regarding this decision, Hamilton noted, "It is not necessary to view Lot's choice as based on avarice." That word there means to extreme greed, especially for wealth or for material gain. All right, Hamilton here says that, it's not necessary to look at Lot's choice and say that that was based on some type of extreme greed. There's no indication that he is covetous. He can hardly be blamed for that choice. That this lush land would one day be the target of divine wrath is a fact Lot could hardly have known. Even so, every decision has a consequence. Lot's decision to camp towards Sodom certainly did. The author of our big book talks about this passage. He says the sin of the men of Sodom was their homosexuality. Jude says the men of the city gave themselves over to sexual immorality and went after strange flesh. The men of Sodom throughout the Bible represents the essence of rebellion against God. Those who claim homosexuality is a lifestyle of neutral moral consequence need to read the scriptures more closely. And so as we look at this, we see that one of the chief things that's under consideration for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is the sin of homosexuality. That brings us now to verse 12 in our text. And we see that Lot chose here to locate in the plains. In verse 12, then the men said to Lot, he's there in Sodom, what happens? Have you anyone else here, son-in-laws, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, take them out of this place. And so the angels tell Lot, hey, you need to grab up your people, it's time to go. Verse 13, for we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. On page 142, we see that it says that Longman observed that it is interesting to note that God is not just responding from his own revulsion to the evil of Sodom, but he is acting in response to the outcry against its people. Though we are never explicitly told who exactly is crying out to God, certainly whoever they are, they experience the oppression and violence of the people of Sodom. God's judgment comes from his holy nature, but it also provides help to the oppressed. And so we see that what's happening here is due to the outcry against the city. There have been obviously those who cried out to God because of mistreatment that they had suffered, injustice, what have you, other things that are taking place there. And so God has heard that cry. You go to the book of Revelation, and there are those who have been martyred who are crying out to God, how long? And of course, we know that God eventually, in his time, destroyed Rome, took care of the juggernaut that was the Roman Empire. God will always take care of things. Evil will always be punished. But God does that in his time. In fact, I've said many times, all wrongs will not be righted this side of eternity. Okay? All wrongs that occur in your life, those might not be righted here in this life. But all wrongs will be righted. It might not take place during our lifetime, and it might not take place until the judgment day, but all wrongs will be righted by the God of heaven. We know that because of his nature, because of his justice. He has to, because of his just nature, he has to punish evil, and God will always do that. In verse 14, so Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and said, get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But to his sons-in-law, he seemed to be joking. Something that I thought was interesting here, their disposition toward the message that they're receiving did not change the truthfulness and the accuracy of the message. And just because they didn't receive it as truth, just because they thought it was a big joke, just because they had no concern about it, that did not change the truthfulness and the accuracy of the message. The message that Lot was delivering, whether they believed it or not, was true. And of course, for them, and very soon, they're going to learn that it was accurate, that it was truthful, because they are going to be some of the ones that are going to be destroyed in the city. Just because people don't accept the message, that doesn't change the message. That doesn't mean that the message is any less truthful or any less accurate. In verse 15, when the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, Arise, take your wife and your two daughters, who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. And so Lot's been pleading with the sons-in-laws. He's been trying to gather up his family so that they can get out. The angels say, hey, it's time to go. There's no more pleading with people. Take your wife, grab your daughters, and y'all go, unless you want to be consumed. Verse 16, and while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hands, and the hands of his two daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. On page 43, the author says, despite the clear warning and present danger, Lot lingered, or in the New American Standard Version, he hesitated. So Lot's been told, go now. He's still not going. His reluctance to leave Sodom is perhaps a mirror of our own unwillingness to leave sin behind. There's an interesting parallel there that, he's not wanting to leave Sodom, and sometimes we don't want to let go of sin. Thankfully, we read, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hands, and the hands of his two daughters. And I love this phrase here, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside of the city. Kisling remarked, the unnecessary mention of each member of the family shows the Lord's concern for each person who has any openness at all to the Lord. It's interesting. I love that phrase, the Lord being merciful to him. God didn't have to do this. The angels told him to go. If he's not going, that's really on him. But we see the mercy of God. God still working with him. God, in this case, grabbing him by the hand and saying, you're going. God, yes, he punishes evil. But God is merciful. God is gracious. If we will open ourselves up to him, we have a God who is a wonderful God. And we see a glimpse of that right here and what's taking place. In verse 17, so it came to pass, when they had brought them outside, that he said, escape for your life, do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain, escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. And so you see, once again, the instructions being given, here's what you need to do. And then once again, we see Lot's hesitation in doing that. Verse 18, then Lot said to them, please know, my lords, indeed now your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have increased your mercy, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. See now, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Please let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live. It's interesting to me. You would think here Lot would just be thankful. Hey, you're sparing me. Where do you want me to go? On to the mountains. All right, we're going there. But we see Lot. He's saying something bad will happen if I go to the mountains. Let me go here to this city. We're going to see the name of the city is Zoar. Verse 21, then he said to him, see, I have favored you concerning this thing also, and that I will not overthrow this city for which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. And so, interestingly enough, this small city is going to be spared because of the presence of Lot and his family. On page 144, the author says, according to Gangle and Brammer, God's grace stretched even further, but the urgency was pressing. Judgment had been declared, but it could not be delivered until Lot's family was safe. So they headed for the smallest of the 5 cities of the plain, Zoar, whose name means small. An amazing thing happened there. God spared Zoar because Lot was in it. And so of all the cities of the plain that are going to be destroyed, Zoar is going to be spared because of Lot. Verse 23. The sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. And so remember, it was nightfall when the angels had arrived. All the events that have transpired through the night. Lot's been trying to gather up his family. Finally, they arrive in Zoar, and when they arrive in Zoar, it's when the sun's coming up. Verse 24, Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. So he overthrew those cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the city, and what grew on the ground. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. The author says, sadly, Lot's wife was also a casualty of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Reporting this, Genesis 19:26 states, But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. It is possible she was from Sodom. Was she looking back because of loved ones left behind? Did she fail to believe the city would actually be destroyed? Had she decided to go back? Regardless, her actions were a direct violation of the angel's orders. Curavella wrote, The disobedience of Lot's wife was costly. It led to her petrification as a pillar of salt. Her yearning for what she was leaving behind led to her downfall, and she ends up a parable. Luke 17:32, we have the quote, Remember Lot's wife. And so we have now just Lot and his daughters that are going to escape safely from the destruction. Verse 27, And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Then he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and saw and behold, the smoke of the land went up, like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of their midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt. The author writes, as Steinman noted, the smoke rising from the land like the smoke of a furnace emphasizes God's presence as the judge who meted out this punishment. While Abraham did not explore the complete depths of God's compassion on his righteous people, he stopped at 10 righteous persons. God nevertheless took Abraham's plea for Sodom and Gomorrah to the extreme by extracting Lot before the firestone fell on the Jordan plain. We are again reminded of God's grace and mercy. You know, sometimes people turn to this and look, and they only see the vengeful side of God. God had agreed not to destroy it if 10 righteous people could be found. Y'all, just 10. This was a large city. And all God said, hey, if you can find 10 righteous people in it, then I'll spare it. 10 couldn't even be found. There were not even 10 righteous people located in the city. And so, while people focus on the vengeance and the wrath of God, in this account also on display is His grace and His mercy. The author gives us a few applications to note. Number 1, as the prophet Habakkuk declared, God is of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Consequently, He acts justly when punishing sin. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, such punishment was certainly warranted. The behavior of the men of Sodom was vile. Homosexuality is likewise condemned in the New Testament. Thankfully, those who repent of sin will be forgiven. Describing this, Paul said of the Corinthians, and such were some of you. You know, you read in the verses that immediately precede verse 11, you see a whole list of sins, homosexuality being one of the ones listed there. He says, and such were some of you. But you were washed, but you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus and by the Spirit of our God. And so we see here God's forgiveness extends to all who are willing to take hold of it. A second application that we have in the text, and when God provides directions, man is not at liberty to violate God's will. The angels told Lot and his family not to look back at Sodom. Lot's wife disobeyed and died as a result. Jesus challenged his audience to learn from her mistake in Luke 17:32. God must be obeyed. This was true for Lot and his family, and it remains true for us today. We must do what God says in order to be saved. You know, to me, it's very simple. If you want God's salvation, then you have to follow God's plan. Lot and his family wanted to be saved, and they had to do what God had said. And the same is true for us today. The author of the big book closes out, and we'll use his words in the conclusion to do so. Stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Lot, his daughters, and their sons contain important lessons people of God need to learn. First and last, the story explains the importance of picking one's company. Anyone who supposes the company he keeps has no influences on the character he develops needs to read about Lot. Lot began by choosing the well-watered plains of the Jordan. He ended by having his home and his family torn from him. His life was transformed by the company he chose. It is not merely a truism when parents urge young people to select their friends wisely. Not only will others judge a person by the company he keeps, but one's company has a way of changing who one is. Well, that brings us to the end of the lesson this morning. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to spend some time with me in the study of God's Word. We'll continue to do this every Sunday morning until we're back in regular services. But I appreciate you taking time to be with me today. Remember, friends, stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay prayerful, and I hope that you have a great day.